The first time they noticed her shadow, Lela was only a few days old. The midwife had swaddled her tightly, placing her in the moonlit corner of the hut while the village women hummed their birth blessings. But as the chants filled the air, someone gasped and pointed. The baby's shadow, sharp as a spear, stretched twice the length of her tiny body, twitching on its own across the floor. It crawled up the wall, paused near the thatch, then slithered back like smoke slipping under a door. She was born during a bad moon, someone muttered. The blood moon, another whispered. No child should have a shadow that moves first. That was the beginning. Lela grew up on the outskirts of the village, not by distance but by eyes. The kind of eyes that follow you but never meet your gaze. Children were told not to play with her. If she passed by, adults made the sign against spirits on their chests. Her presence was never enough to curse someone outright, but it was enough to keep her away. There was no proof of danger, only the wrongness that danced beside her. She walked with her head lowered, eyes on the dirt, careful not to startle anyone with her voice or her presence. But no matter how quiet her feet were, her shadow always gave her away. It darted ahead, sometimes dragging behind. Once, it flickered across the healer's compound when Lela was nowhere nearby. Another time, it curled around the feet of a sleeping goat, and the animal refused to walk for a week. But Mama Nia never feared her. Mama Nia was old like tree bark, layered, cracked and wise. She wore silence like others wore robes. Her hair was a crown of coiled silver, and her voice carried the weight of storms. She had raised Lela alone since the girl's mother died giving birth. And though the village treated them like whispers best forgotten, Mama Nia never let the girl forget who she was. They fear what they don't understand, she'd say, stirring porridge slowly over a small flame. But fear is not your burden to carry. Lela would sit near her, trying to hide her long shadow beneath the mat, curling her knees to her chest. Why does it follow me like that? She asked once, voice barely above a breath. Mama Nia reached out and touched the shadow where it curled along the floor. It doesn't follow you, my child. It walks ahead of you. It remembers who you are before the world tried to forget. But it moves when I don't, Lela whispered. Then maybe it knows where you're meant to go. Mama Nia taught her how to move with silence, how to read the language of wind and ash. She taught her that not all things need to be seen to be known. They lived in a small hut near the boundary of the yam fields, with herbs drying from the rafters and pots full of charmed salt. Mama Nia was once a respected voice among the elders, but after defending an accused boy who vanished into the forest, she was cast out of council matters. That suited her fine. She said the only counsel worth listening to was the one spoken in dreams. And it was in dreams that Lela's shadow first spoke. Not in words but in movement. In the still dark hours before dawn, Lela would wake and see it, her shadow dancing along the walls, bending in ways her body never could. It stretched toward the corners of the hut, touched the jars of ash, curled around Mama Nia's sleeping form, and then settled once more beneath her feet. In the village they began to call her names. Shadow Spawn. Ghostborn. The girl with no anchor. Once, a group of boys threw pebbles at her and laughed when her shadow dodged the stones before she flinched. Demon girl, they shouted. She said nothing. She never shouted back, never wept in front of them. Instead, when the sun began to set and their laughter faded into the night, she'd walk home barefoot, her shadow gliding beside her like a silent companion. Sometimes it would grow tall and sharp, slicing the last orange light of dusk like a blade. Other times it curled like a sleeping cat around her feet. Mama Nia never asked about the names they called her. She only looked at her with knowing eyes and said, "Let the shadow walk when the voice cannot." So Lela learned. She learned that silence was not weakness but a different kind of song. She learned to walk through the market without being seen, to listen to every whisper, every crack and every mask worn by the villagers. She learned that shadows don't lie. They stretch to show the shape of truth. She began writing small stories with charcoal on scrap cloth, tales of children who could vanish into light, of girls whose shadows swallowed storms. She buried them under the cooking stones, tucked them in the hollow tree behind the yam field, whispered them into the fire. And each time she did, her shadow danced. By the time she was 14, Lela had become something unspoken in the village. A myth while still breathing. An omen with a pulse. But she never cursed anyone. Never harmed a soul. She only watched. And remembered. Because Mama Nia had told her, "There will come a day when you must stand still, and they will try to erase you. But your shadow, child, your shadow will not let them." And Lela believed her. Even when the world refused to see her, even when her voice was swallowed by silence, even when the blood moon rose again and fear thickened the air like smoke, her shadow never left. The morning Mama Nia died, the sun did not rise the way it used to. It crept instead, slow and reluctant, as if unsure whether the world should move forward at all. A single bird cried once and then went quiet. The sky held the breath of something lost, and the air tasted like still water. Lella had woken just before the shift, sensing something. The silence had changed, no longer soft, no longer protective. It was the kind of silence that comes only after something holy has slipped away. She reached for Mama Nia's hand beneath the woven mat. It was cold. Not stiff. Not frozen. But cold enough to still the blood in Lella's own fingers. "Mama?" she whispered. No answer came. She pressed her head to her grandmother's chest, listening for the rhythm that had guided her every day, the beat that had calmed storms, sung herbs into bloom, and taught her to trust what wasn't seen. But there was no song. No whisper. No breath. Only quiet. Only goodbye. Lella didn't cry at first. She sat beside Mama Nia's body, wrapping her gently in the red cloth embroidered with prayer lines. She swept the floor. She lit the charcoal. She mixed the balm of river stone and oil just as she had been taught. Her hands moved like memory. Her eyes did not blink. The world around her blurred, as though her shadow had stepped forward to do the work while her heart lay stunned in the dust. The sun climbed higher and the village stirred. Word spread quickly. It always did with the dead. By the time the sun reached the edge of the yams, the village square was filled with murmurs. The chief arrived in his layered robes, stiff with pride. His wife, who had once been Mama Nia's closest friend and then her fiercest enemy, wore a veil too dark for mourning. "She died before dawn," someone whispered. Her heart must have given out. She was too old to fight the shadows anymore. But others looked toward the hut and said nothing. Some had come to fear Mama Nia, with her deep gaze and herb-scented breath. Others had quietly sought her help in the dead of night. She had delivered babies, healed broken bones, silenced fevers. And now she was gone. Lella emerged from the hut with quiet feet. Her hair was tied back. Her eyes were dry. But her shadow dragged long behind her, stretching past the door and into the dirt like a wound. She stood in the light, looking at the elders, waiting for the rites to begin. But the chief raised his hand. "The girl will not attend the burial," he said. Gasps rippled like wind in dry leaves. "She is not pure," his wife added. "Mama Nia's soul must rise clean. That shadow will drag it down." Lella opened her mouth, but her voice caught behind her teeth. She tried again, but it stayed trapped, wrapped in something dark and rising. A decree was read aloud. Words carved with pride and fear. Lella, they said, had been born under the wrong sky, raised in secrets and whispered to things no one could name. Her shadow was not of this world. Let her grieve at home, far from the sacred path. Let her weep, but not near the grave. The villagers did not fight it. Some nodded slowly, others looked away. No one spoke in her defense. Not even those who had once held their babies to her chest for blessings. When Lella tried to step forward, 2 guards stood in her path. Their spears were wooden, not steel, but the line they drew was colder than iron. She did not plead. She did not argue. Instead, she stepped back and sat in the dust. The sun climbed higher and the procession formed. They wrapped Mama Nia's body in white this time. The prayer cloth was taken from her without a word. They chanted the sacred verses, verses Mama Nia herself had once taught them. They walked toward the burial hill with the chief at the front, lifting his staff high as if he led something noble. But Lella stayed behind. She stayed beside the hut, where the herbs still hung and the ashes were still warm. She watched them go, her knees drawn to her chest, her fingers pressed to the ground. She didn't blink. She didn't move. But her tears ran freely now, and they fell into the dust like tiny offerings. And as she cried, her shadow stretched again, slow, long, and quiet. It slid along the path after the procession, thin and careful, like smoke chasing firelight. No one saw it leave her side. No one saw it rise to meet the road. But far ahead, as the casket was lowered into the earth and the chief raised his voice in triumph, a breeze passed through the crowd, cool and sharp. And some swore they saw a flicker, a shape dark and thin, resting beside the grave like a second mourner. Back at the hut, Lella lay her head on the earth, listening for one last heartbeat. She found none. But deep below, in the oldest bones of the hill, something stirred. And her shadow did not return. Lella did not leave the hut for days. The world outside moved on without her. Children played, elders gossiped, smoke curled from cooking fires, but inside Mama Nia's hut, time thickened. The air grew heavy, unmoving. The herbs hanging from the rafters sagged. The ground beneath her mat felt colder than usual. And silence, once her sanctuary, had become a jail with no keys. She ate nothing. Drank nothing. The bowl of porridge left at her door by an old neighbor grew mold, then vanished, replaced by nothing. Even pity has a limit. She curled herself into the same corner where she once used to grind herbs for Mama Nia. Her fingers traced the patterns in the dirt over and over, but the spiral never ended. Her mind had turned inward, looping around grief, rage, and disbelief. She hadn't said goodbye. She hadn't even touched the burial cloth. She had only watched, locked out of the last moment, her soul left behind like an unfinished sentence. And still her shadow stayed. At first, it lingered at her feet like always, silent, loyal, waiting. But then it started to change. On the second day, Lela noticed it twitch. Not like a trick of light but like breath, too fast, too nervous. It curled around the clay pot she hadn't touched in days. Then it crept toward the hearth. She watched it stretch, thin and slow, brushing against the ashes in the pit where Mama Nia's fire once burned. By the third day, it stopped responding to her movements. When she turned her head, it lagged behind. When she reached out her arm, it stayed still. At first she thought she was imagining it, but shadows don't delay. They don't choose their own pace. They certainly don't wander. Hers did. She whispered into the darkness, "What are you doing?" The shadow slid toward the door. It lay flat against the mat like it wanted to slip under it. It pulsed. Not light, not shape, but something deeper. A rhythm. A call. A knowing. Lela sat up, weak but sharp. "You miss her too," she said, voice hoarse. "Don't you?" The shadow didn't answer. But it stayed near the door for hours, long after Lela had sunk back to the floor. That night the firelight flickered low. Lela couldn't sleep. Her body ached from hunger, but worse than that was the weight in her chest. A dull, grinding pressure like her ribs had forgotten how to lift. Her face remained dry now. She had no more tears. Only grit in her mouth and a ringing in her ears that sounded like wind trapped in a cave. She lay on her back, watching the flickers of orange light dance on the ceiling. Then slowly her eyes moved to the far wall. Her shadow was not lying beside her. It was standing. Tall, upright, facing the door. She sat up fast. The shadow stood still for a moment longer, then took one long, deliberate step forward. Lela's breath caught. "You can move without me now," she whispered. The shadow said nothing, but its form thinned, narrowed, stretched along the doorframe like smoke about to slip out. She rose shakily to her knees. The floor swayed beneath her feet. Her hand reached for the clay wall for support. She felt like someone pulled apart and stitched back together wrong. "Wait," she whispered. "If I can't go, can you?" The shadow didn't flinch. Lela stepped closer to it, just enough to feel the warmth left in the place it stood. Her hand hovered above the wooden latch. "I'm not allowed out," she said. She remembered the guards. Their spears. The decree. She remembered being told she would taint the soul of the only person who ever believed in her. She remembered how no one had stood up for her. But the shadow, this strange, stubborn echo of her, was still trying, still moving, still reaching for the road. She pressed her forehead to the door and spoke low, "Find her." Her knees gave out and she collapsed by the door, arms wrapped around herself, the ache too wide to name. Outside the night whispered. Dogs barked in the distance. A pot cracked. Somewhere a mother sang a lullaby. And then she saw it. The shadow stretched under the crack in the door. Thin as thread. Quick as breath. It slipped out. Gone. Lela gasped. Not out of fear but awe. The hut felt immediately colder without it. Like some piece of her had unhooked and floated into the open world. She crawled back to the center of the hut and curled up by the hearth, alone for the first time in a way that truly meant something. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't just silence. It was the absence of something sacred. But she wasn't afraid. She didn't need to be. Because something had changed. For the first time since Mama Nia's death, she didn't feel completely trapped. Some part of her had crossed the threshold. And tomorrow the village would learn. Her shadow walks. The sky over the sacred hill hung heavy with stillness, like it too held its breath. The procession wound its way up the narrow path in solemn silence. A river of white cloth, murmured prayers and respectful steps. Mama Nia's body was wrapped in ivory linen stitched with old prayers, her silver-streaked hair tucked neatly, her hands crossed as if still guiding someone in dreams. Only the elders and those declared of clean lineage were allowed at the burial. The village guards stood like statues at the hill's base, spears planted in the dirt, eyes sharp. Lela was not among the mourners. The decree was clear, she was forbidden. She had not even tried to follow. And yet, as the village climbed, the wind picked up. Not loud but different. It moved sideways through the trees, rustling leaves that had not stirred in weeks. A few of the older women whispered that Mama Nia had always had a way of waking the wind. They tried not to meet one another's eyes. At the hill's crest, the grave was already dug. A small, square hollow lined with stones and prayer beads. The chief, robed in black and gold, stood tall at its edge. His voice rang through the air like the clang of a pot, sharp and prideful. "Today," he declared, "we return to the earth one of our oldest voices. Mama Nia was many things, healer, midwife, keeper of stories. But her time has passed. And with her passing, let us welcome the silence that follows." A few heads bowed. A few lips tightened. Many remembered that it was this same chief who had once banned her remedies from the healing hut, who had accused her of planting doubt in the minds of women. But no one challenged him now. It was not the time. As the final prayer was read, and the drummers gave 3 soft beats, the coffin was lowered. The ropes creaked gently. The cloth shimmered in the sunlight. Then it happened. A hush, deeper than silence, settled over the mourners. And then someone gasped, sharp like a cut. Their hand pointed to the grave. At first they thought it was the play of the sun. A trick of light on polished stone. But no. There it was. A shadow. Long. Thin. Not cast by anyone present. It stood just to the left of the casket, stretching beside it, unmoving. Its outline too sharp, too dark. It didn't sway with the leaves. It didn't shift with the sun. Just stood. One of the old women clutched her chest. Another dropped her prayer beads. Even the chief paused mid-chant, his brow tightening. "That's," someone whispered, too afraid to say it aloud. Everyone knew whose shadow it was. Lela's. No one else had a shadow that long. That quiet. That strange. It stretched now like a second mourner, its head bowed, its arms at its sides, cast against the dirt without a body to claim it. One of the young initiates stepped forward, thinking maybe it was a cloth or a drape caught by the wind. But as he neared, the shadow didn't ripple. Didn't move. Didn't fade. The coffin lay still. The drums were silent. The wind circled the hill like a breath pulled in and held too long. Someone whispered, "She came anyway." Another said, "Not her. Her shadow." And then silence again. A goat bleated far off in the valley. A baby, restless on her mother's back, began to cry, high-pitched and inconsolable. One of the elders tried to continue the rites, but the words would not come. His mouth moved, but the sound was swallowed like the air itself had gone thick. The chief's wife reached for her husband's arm. "Say something," she hissed. But he had nothing. Because the shadow had not moved. Because the casket was not alone. Because something deeper than grief had entered the ground. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the wind calmed. The drums gave a slow beat, just one. And the shadow began to fade. Not like smoke. Not like mist. But like ink being slowly drawn back into the page. It stretched longer for a moment, then shortened. The shape grew thinner like a thread pulled tight, then slipped away into the earth. Gone. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, the chief cleared his throat and finished the ritual, but his voice had lost its shine. "Mama Nia returns to the soil," he said. "Let the path be clear." But everyone knew it wasn't. The villagers descended the hill in uneasy silence, each of them glancing behind, wondering if the shadow would return. None of them saw the small white feather tucked under the edge of the casket. None of them noticed how the air had changed. Only the earth knew. And somewhere in a hut below the hill, a girl sat in the dark, her eyes open, her body weak, but her lips curled into something that almost looked like strength. Her shadow had walked. And now it had returned. Smoke still hung low over the sacred hill, hours after the burial had ended. The air carried the weight of something unsaid, something ancient and unsettled. No one lingered near the grave, not even the keepers of the grounds. The village elders gathered in the council hut, whispering in rushed voices, their eyes darting to the corners as though something might be listening. "It was her," one of them said, voice low but urgent. "Her shadow." "Shadows don't move without bodies," muttered another. "That was no trick. We all saw it." The chief sat at the head of the circle, jaw clenched, robes slightly singed at the hem where the burial cloth had caught fire. He hadn't told the others yet, not the full truth. That the flame hadn't come from his lantern or the sun or the incense smoke, but from the very moment his hand tried to cover the shadow. It had recoiled as if rejecting the gesture. And the fire had sparked instantly, alive, furious. Now, in the dim hut, the air felt no warmer than it had on that hill, cold despite the flame, like something had followed them down. One elder, bent with age but sharp-eyed, stood and slammed her walking stick once into the floor. "This is a breach," she said firmly. "A breach between the living and the dead. Between silence and voice. We buried her with secrets, and secrets do not sleep." Others murmured agreement. A few glanced toward the doorway, half expecting the shadow to slither beneath it. Back on the hill, long after the elders had fled, a few villagers had remained behind. Women who whispered stories instead of following rules, children too young to be afraid. Among them was a girl named Muna, only 10, with braids still unfinished and curiosity like fire in her chest. She had not run when the cloth caught flame. She had seen it, how the shadow moved before it faded. Not just beside the casket but toward the sky. One long limb of it stretched upward as if reaching, yearning. She had heard something then. Not with her ears exactly but deep inside her chest. A vibration more than a voice. "I am not forbidden," it had said. "I remember." Muna repeated the words all the way home. That night, while the elders argued and the chief brooded, the village did not sleep. Hens refused to roost. The dogs barked endlessly. Shadows lingered too long in corners. The night itself seemed restless, as if something was pacing just out of sight. The chief's wife bolted upright in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, claiming she saw Lela's eyes staring at her from the mirror. Across the village, firelight flickered without fuel. And in Mama Nia's hut, Lela's shadow moved again. It slid across the wall like water poured sideways. Lela sat still, legs crossed, too weak to stand. She had eaten a few bites of yam someone had left outside her door, but mostly she drank water and listened, to the floorboards, to the wind through the cracks, to the silence that wasn't quite silence anymore. The shadow drifted toward her and settled at her feet. "Did they see you?" she asked it softly. The shadow lengthened slightly, like a nod. "What did you show them?" A shiver rippled through the hut. Lela closed her eyes. She could still feel the pressure of the hill, the weight of the dirt around Mama Nia's body, even though she hadn't been there. She felt it because her shadow had carried her grief, and now it returned bearing something else. Power. Memory. The voice of a promise that had refused to stay buried. She slept, but the village did not. By morning, word had spread like floodwater. Not just about the shadow or the fire, but about what Muna had heard. The phrase became an echo, "I am not forbidden. I remember." It passed from mouth to mouth like a riddle, like a warning. And for the first time in decades, the temple doors were shut. The priests refused to hold their morning chants. They said the gods were silent. No one wanted to speak aloud what they were all beginning to fear. Lela's shadow had not just mourned. It had spoken. And the dead were listening. The morning after the long night, a summons rang through the village like a cracked drum. "The girl will stand trial," the chief announced from the steps of the council house, his voice brittle with fear masked as authority. His eyes were sunken. His lips moved as if reluctant to speak the name. But he did. Lela. Villagers gathered in hushed circles. Some came out of dread. Others out of guilt. Most out of curiosity, to see what would happen to the girl whose shadow refused to obey the laws of men. Lela was dragged from Mama Nia's hut by 2 trembling guards. She did not resist. Her steps were slow, silent. She walked as if her feet were not on the ground at all. In fact, when one woman looked down, she swore by her ancestors. There were no footprints in the dust behind her. She whispered it to her husband, "She walks but she leaves no trace." Lela was brought to the center of the gathering circle, where trials were held. It was a dusty patch surrounded by thorn stakes. Elders sat on carved stools, the chief in the highest seat. They avoided looking directly at her, as if her face held answers they feared to hear. "Lela," the chief began, voice uncertain. "You are charged with sorcery, with disturbing the passage of death, with dark communion." Lela said nothing. "You are accused of summoning your shadow to haunt this village." Still silence. The wind blew gently, lifting a few strands of her hair. She stood in the center of the circle like a statue carved from the stillness itself. "She mocks the trial," spat one elder. "She thinks herself above our laws," said another. But the youngest of them, a woman with streaks of white in her braids, looked long and hard at the girl. She did not speak. Her hands trembled. The chief raised his hand. "Let judgment begin." And then, someone spoke Lela's name. Not the chief. Not an elder. Just a guard, trying to whisper to another, "Isn't her name Lela?" But it was enough. The ground darkened. Shadows slithered from the edges of the gathering. Not fast. Not loud. But steady. Determined. From beneath huts, from under thorn bushes, from inside the very cracks of the council's platform, the shadow came. It did not rise from her feet this time. It came from everywhere. It circled the council. A ring of shade that thickened and swirled, as if the village itself was remembering. The air turned heavy. One elder gasped and collapsed sideways. The guards dropped their spears and ran. Even the chief stood, heart racing. His voice caught in his throat. And then a voice cut through the silence. Not Lella's. Not the chief's. It came from the crowd, from an old man no one had seen in years. He wore faded priest robes and a string of bone charms around his neck. His eyes were milky, but he walked straight into the center without stumbling. "I remember her," he said. The crowd gasped. She was born on the blood moon. The night the sky split in red. The old gods marked her shadow, not with curse but with duty. He turned to the elders, eyes gleaming. "You have forgotten the story." "I have not. There was once a keeper among us. A child who would walk when memory was threatened. A girl whose silence would hold back the rot of forgetting." He faced Lela now. "You are not cursed, child. You are the keeper of echoes." The ground quivered. A thorn stake snapped clean in two. The elders shouted. Some fell to their knees. One begged for forgiveness from no one in particular. Another covered his ears, screaming, "Make the shadow stop." But Lela did nothing. She only blinked as if waking from a long sleep. The shadow ring tightened once, then loosened, like a heartbeat. The old priest raised his hands. "Let her go. She is not ours to judge." And just like that, the circle of shade melted away. The dust cleared. The wind calmed. Lela stepped forward. The crowd parted. No one stopped her. It began with a low growl in the sky, not thunder, not wind, but something older. Something that made bones ache before the rain began to fall. The village had gone quiet after the trial. No one spoke of Lela out loud, but everyone thought of her. Children played with more caution. Elders lit candles without naming who they were for. And the chief did not leave his compound, claiming illness, though the guards whispered his shadow no longer matched his movement. But it was the sacred hill that bore the storm's anger. At dusk, the wind rose with a voice. It screamed across the thatched roofs and snapped trees at their waists. The sky turned the color of old iron. Lightning danced but did not strike. It coiled around the clouds like restless serpents. Then came the rain. It did not fall, it slammed, drumming the earth, drenching everything. The river swelled. The burial ground at the top of the sacred hill became soaked in minutes. The villagers watched from behind closed shutters as the earth shuddered under the weight of the storm. And then they heard it. Crack. A tearing sound. Like a tree being split down its trunk. The next morning when the clouds cleared, the hill looked wounded. A long jagged split had opened down the center. And in the center of that scar, like a tooth rising from the jaw of the earth, was a coffin. Mama Nia's coffin. Not broken. Not rotted. It sat upright in the mud, soil clinging to its sides, flowers blooming around its base despite the storm. No one could explain it. No one dared to touch it. Until Lela came. She walked barefoot up the hill, her steps silent. The villagers gathered behind her, not daring to follow. Only the old priest stood beside her. She approached the coffin slowly, her breath steady, her hands shaking. With one touch, the lid creaked open. Inside, Mama Nia's body lay as if asleep. Her skin smooth, her face peaceful. In her right hand, wrapped gently around her fingers, was a scroll sealed with river clay. Lela lifted it carefully. It was dry, untouched by water or time. She broke the seal. And read aloud. "To my Lela? If you are reading this, then they have done to you what they feared most, tried to bury you. Know this, when they block your feet, let your shadow go first. It will find the cracks they tried to seal. It will remind them what they tried to forget. You are the echo of every girl they silenced, every truth they buried, every grief they ignored. What they bury unjustly will bloom again in thunder. You do not need a voice to speak. You are made of silence, but you walk louder than drums. I will be with you, in the earth, in the wind, and in the hush before the storm." Lela did not cry. She only closed her eyes. The earth beneath her hummed. And behind her, the villagers began to kneel, not out of worship, but recognition. They saw her truly for the first time. The girl they mocked, feared, ignored. Now the one chosen by the very land they lived on. Suddenly a second crack tore through the hill. This one deeper. The ground shifted, and a portion of the sacred hill collapsed gently inward, revealing dark, rich soil. But what grew from within it wasn't stone or root, it was shape. Root tendrils stretched upward, twisting together. And then the villagers gasped. The roots were shaped like hands. Dozens of them, palms open, fingers stretched toward the sky as if reaching for breath. Some large and calloused, others small and delicate. All rising from the earth in silent protest. They were not bones. They were not statues. They were alive, pulsing faintly with the energy of something that remembered. Lela stepped closer and whispered, "You heard me." The roots did not move, but the wind stirred in response. The old priest bowed. "These are the buried truths," he said softly. "Those they tried to erase." That night no one slept. They gathered quietly at the base of the hill, watching the hands rise. Children placed flowers between their fingers. Women touched their foreheads to the soil. Even men who once mocked Lela stood in silence. The coffin was returned to the earth, but not buried. It was placed gently in a circle of blooming wildflowers. A shrine reborn. And as the stars blinked awake above them, Lela stood on the edge of the hill, scroll in hand, and said her first words in public since the trial. She was never truly gone. And neither now was she. The village changed, not all at once, but like ink soaking slowly into cloth. After the hill cracked open, after Mama Nia's scroll was read, and after the roots shaped like hands rose from the soil, the fear began to fade. Not disappear, but bend. It became something softer, something thoughtful. People began to look over their shoulders, not because they were afraid of Lela, but because they wondered if she might be near. Not Lela herself, but her shadow. It had become a symbol not of danger but of truth. A shape that moved when silence failed, when no one listened, when injustice needed a witness. People began visiting her at night. Never in large numbers. Never with loud steps. They came like whispers, one by one. Orphans. Widows. Girls who had been struck too often. Boys who were told crying was shameful. People who had seen things and swallowed them like stones. They would stand near the tree that once held Mama Nia's scrolls, or near the edge of the sacred hill and wait. Sometimes they lit a small candle. Sometimes they left a feather, a stone, or a symbol scratched in the dust. And Lela would appear. Or at least her shadow would. Sometimes her real body stayed inside Mama Nia's hut. But her shadow, long, soft, silent, moved through the village like a question unanswered. She would stand beside a grieving mother and not speak a word, yet the woman would leave smiling faintly. She would appear in the corner of a hut where a father was about to raise his hand in anger, and the father would pause, see his own shadow curled in shame and lower his voice. Children began whispering stories. They called her the silent sister, the one who walked where voices broke. Soon the young ones who felt invisible asked her to teach them. Lela would take them into the forest by moonlight. Not to chant or cast but to listen. To watch how the moon bends light. How a shadow reveals what a face hides. How silence is not emptiness, but a canvas for meaning. She taught them how to speak with their hands. How to leave messages and footsteps. How to use dreams as drums. She taught them how to make their shadows walk without them. The village chief noticed the shift. The people no longer bowed when he passed. The elders began muttering among themselves. Worst of all, his own shadow began to disobey. At first it was small. He would walk east and his shadow stretched behind him, but just a little too far. He would raise his hand and the shadow's fingers would twitch, slowly. Then it became worse. He awoke one morning to find his shadow already standing beside the door, waiting. He shouted at it, threw water at it, but it did not move. Then one afternoon as he stood on the council platform trying to declare a new tax, he looked down and saw. His shadow was no longer with him. It had left. It had followed Lela. He screamed. The villagers didn't laugh. They didn't jeer. They simply turned away, their own shadows curling protectively around their feet like loyal dogs. That night the chief fled. He was seen racing through the northern fields, babbling about footsteps he couldn't escape. "They're behind me," he cried. Soft, 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 but they never stop. Some said he wandered into the hills and vanished. Others say he walks in circles still looking for his shadow. After he left, no one rose to take his place. They didn't need a chief. They had a girl with a shadow. Not a ruler. Not a priestess. Just someone who listened when others could not speak. Someone who watched when others were unseen. Children once too shy to speak stood confidently at the shrine, drawing shapes in the soil. Widows shared their stories and symbols left on tree trunks. Songs were hummed that carried meaning without words. One girl, a mute from birth, was seen standing in front of the sacred hill, her shadow dancing though her feet never moved. And still Lela remained quiet. She smiled rarely. She answered in nods and glances. But her presence was constant. Her silence became the village's song. Even strangers began arriving, people from nearby settlements, hearing rumors of a place where truth walked in shadow form. They came not to worship but to learn. They left with their heads high and their feet lighter. They left changed. Leela never asked for power. But wherever she went, or wherever her shadow lingered, change followed like a second heartbeat. And so, the village followed her shadow. And they never looked back. Leela never wore robes of power. She never claimed a title, never sat in the elders' circle, and never raised her voice in the village square. When they asked her to lead, she simply shook her head. She returned to Mama Nia's hut, now surrounded by flowering vines and smooth stones, and lived as she always had, quiet, listening, present. She grew herbs. She mended clothes. She helped children learn to read the wind. And she never asked for payment. But her presence stretched beyond her small home. Because now, at every funeral in the village, someone would look up and whisper, "She's here." Not Leela herself, but her shadow. It stood beside the grieving, a soft silhouette that never touched but always remained close. It sometimes circled a casket. Sometimes it reached for the hand of a weeping child. Once, it knelt beside a mother who had lost her son, and the woman said later she felt warmth on her back, not heat but memory. The elders never tried to stop it. They couldn't. They had seen what happens when grief is silenced, when love is banned, when goodbyes are forbidden. Now, when someone was buried, especially the outcasts, the accused, the forgotten, her shadow was always there. And the people stopped asking why. Instead they waited for it. Some even sang low songs as the coffin was lowered, hoping the shadow would appear. And most times it did. Leela said nothing of it. She simply tended her garden. When children came to ask her how to make their shadows move, she offered tea and said, "First, you must learn to be still." And when strangers came from distant villages, bringing stories of silent figures that appeared during their darkest nights, she only offered a place to rest. Nothing more. The girl who had once been forbidden from saying goodbye had become the one who helped others do so, without speaking, without claiming anything. When the river overflooded and took 2 boys, her shadow was seen kneeling at the bank, where the reeds bent in prayer. When a widow passed in her sleep with no family left, her coffin was lowered by 3 women, and 1 shadow. Years passed. Children grew up with stories of the shadow sister, and when they asked their parents who she was, the answer never changed. She's the girl who was forbidden from saying goodbye, so her shadow learned how to do it instead. And though Leela aged, her shadow never did. Leela never crowned herself, never asked to be followed. When the chief vanished and the whispers of thunder-buried truth took hold, the village waited, for a sign, for her to claim the shrine, for her to stand atop the sacred hill and become something more than a girl wronged by silence. But Leela returned to her old hut, the one patched with leaves and woven cloth, the one where she had once wept as a child when her mother's hands were stolen by illness and her stepfather's scorn. She took no crown. She took no revenge. She lit a single lamp inside her home and resumed tending to herbs and mending blankets. Some say she even sang again, soft and cracked, not to anyone but to the empty spaces. Yet the village was never the same. They came to her door, not loudly, never during the day. Only at dusk or after midnight, always with humility and fear trembling in their fingers. A father who had lost his daughter during childbirth. A widow who never saw her husband's face after the war. A mute boy whose voice had been taken by cruelty. They came not to speak but to be near her. And when they left lighter. Not because Leela offered wisdom. She rarely spoke. Not because she healed with magic. Her hands were just hands. But because when grief hovered over their shoulders, when sorrow made their chests too tight to breathe, they noticed something strange. Their shadows began to move like hers. At the first funeral after the trial, the villagers gathered to bury a child who had died of fever. The ceremony was solemn. The drums beat low. And just before the final soil was placed, someone saw her, not Leela in the flesh but her shadow. It stood by the grieving mother, holding no hand but sharing her trembling. It touched the child's woven mat and then vanished like mist and heat. Whispers erupted. At the next funeral, 2 elders died in their sleep. This time, several people saw it, Leela's shadow again circling the caskets, pausing near the foreheads, bowing toward the sunset. The priests, the same ones who once tried to call her cursed, now kept quiet. They said nothing when people brought offerings not to the temple but to Leela's doorstep. Candles, drawings, even a shoe made of banana fiber shaped like the one she could never wear. And still Leela did not open her door. She remained in silence, choosing the solitude of quiet nights over the power she could have claimed. But something else grew. Children began playing shadow games again, tracing shapes on the mud floors, whispering stories about the girl who walks in the shade. Artists painted images of a figure outlined in black, standing among graves watching stars. Women tied black cloths around their arms during funerals, not for mourning but for respect. Even the trees near Mama Nia's grave grew strange, their branches curled like fingers, roots bursting from the earth as if reaching upward. And through it all Lela aged. Not fast. Not dramatically. But her hair lost its blackness. Her skin wrinkled in quiet places. And though no one ever saw her walk far, her shadow was spotted across many places, not just the village but beyond. In the northern village where soldiers once burned homes, someone claimed Lela's shadow stood among the ashes, helping a child find her grandmother's pendant. In the eastern plains where girls had gone missing, survivors told stories of a woman's silhouette standing before locked doors at dusk, warning those inside before the bandits arrived. She was never seen, only felt. She never spoke. But messages appeared, sometimes carved into bark, sometimes drawn in dust on the floor. Grief is not a prison, the silenced are never alone, what walks in shadow remembers. The elders who once feared her began to invite her shadow to ceremonies. During harvest blessings, during baby naming rituals, they left a space unfilled, saying, for the girl who was forbidden to say goodbye. Some tried to name her formally. The keeper of echoes. The daughter of dust. The first voice of the last silence. But the name never stuck. She remained just Lela. The girl who couldn't be buried. Once, a young girl asked her directly, slipping a note under her door, "Why didn't you ever take the shrine or punish the chief or rule the village like a queen?" Lela responded, the only time she wrote anything at all. The note returned with a line, asterisk, because vengeance teaches nothing, but a walking shadow teaches memory. Asterisk. Eventually no one remembered the name of the chief who fled. His voice, once loud, dissolved into the air like dried leaves. His palace became a school for those without parents, and his throne was broken down and turned into stools for children's desks. But Lela's name remained. And at every funeral, whether for a child, an elder, a stranger, someone would notice her shadow again. Not standing tall, not interrupting, just present. Sometimes touching the casket, sometimes pressing its hands to the earth, sometimes bowing beside the mourners. And always, when someone would ask, "Who is she?" the answer never changed. She's the girl who was forbidden from saying goodbye, so her shadow learned how to do it instead.